Hello to everyone. Welcome to a new session of the Wisdom Pattern: Order, Disorder, and Reorder. I'm going to do it also in two parts, where we're going to talk about great awakens that happened in the world and still have our benefits in a positive way. This is your pastor, Yanti. Students of history know that our current thirst for transcendent is not the first such American experience. The United States has seen 3 spiritual awakens. These were widespread religious awakenings or revivals. These awakenings can be criticized on some levels, but they produced a model of social justice and human rights that is still copied worldwide. The first, which historians call the Great Awakening, carried the seeds of the American Revolution, the United States Constitution, and ultimately the French Revolution. Human consciousness and freedom made a great advance from which we have never withdrawn, at least in principle. The Great Awakening contributed to the modern democratic worldview. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizens, and the concern for the common person. It laid the foundation for the rights of women and minorities. The Second Great Awakening, which began at the turn of the 19th century, contributed to the eventual abolition of slavery. It was almost as if freedom and human dignity were ideas whose time had come. The soul and the spirit had to be ready for the movement of history. The Second Great Awakening, by calling people to reflect on a transcendent reference point, helped pave the way for a higher morality than mere cultural experience. Although most find slavery unthinkable now, it is worth remembering that in much of colonial America, it was assumed that the institution of slavery was embedded in the only way the world had ever been structured. Even in the Bible, Paul assumed that the institution of slavery was normal, a good example of how we cannot normally think outside of our own era and culture. Human consciousness has only slowly been ready for the full Christ, for the freedom of the children of God. No surprise that it took us until the 1980s to begin to see the evil of sexism. The assumption of the necessity of slavery is true. Even the very progressive American Constitution, which, as well all know, was written by white men with men in mind, because women did not have the vote and black men were slaves. Our founding fathers were well-intentioned and brilliant rationalists, but truly blinded by their own time and culture. We also are blinded by our time and culture, and we cannot yet see it. And surely this is a strong example of how education is not the same as transformation. A theme I will continue to emphasize. The mind can only take pictures using the film with which is being loaded. Our inner myth determines what we do and don't notice, what we consider significant and what we ignore. If we had had the openness of ears to hear the full gospel, we would have had the openness of eyes to see that slavery and sexism were significant. But our eyes were not ready yet, nor maybe our heart, nor was history. In the wake of the second spiritual awakening, Abraham Lincoln, 1809-1865, emerged and grew into his greatness. He wasn't always an emancipator, by the way. There must have come an epiphanic moment when he first saw slavery as intolerable. The great souls get there first. Eventually, they filter down to intermediate souls, most of us. And it takes much longer to get to those who are either uninformed or afraid. Those who think that the world can only be structured as they have known it are the slow learners of history. They fail to realize that their slow learning curve is actually a form of narcissism and also a lack of knowledge. Thus, change comes with great difficulty in human history. God seems to rely on the first group of great souls to call the rest of us forward, inch by inch, and they normally suffer a great deal for their foreseeing. Most of us like our comfort zones and take them for granted, as we once took for granted the divine right of kings. The Lincolns of this world are people who have experienced what the New Testament writes termed metanoia. The word literally means a turn around. It is a fundamental transformation of mind and normally brought about by personal suffering, great awareness, or Damascus Road experiences. This reveals an utterly new imaginal world. Until we imagine our world view differently, intellect and will of themselves provide only temporary and often weak change. Metanoia, an utter turnaround, involves seeing with a new mind and is seemingly necessary to transform us personally and to help us transform social structures and institutions. In other words, we are first of all assumed to be on a course of ego, narcissism, and self-interest, with a what's in it for me attitude. Other disciplines might speak of insight, eureka moments, flow, or peak experience, but metanoia is always known to be a grace from nowhere. The recipient always know for sure that it is an utterly unearned gift. If they don't, they are destroyed by their own hubris or pride. The biblical tradition would say that this turnaround is entirely dependent upon an experience of the absolute. Afterward, we know at least three things at a deep level. God is good, the world is good, and I am good. That is all we need in order to begin. We then have an utterly grounded imaginable consciousness, and fear has been foundationally overcome. Our psyche is no longer based in the small self, but in the great self, the Christ self. People like Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, 1822 and 1913, and some abolitionists represents this second awakening. It is embarrassing how absent the voices of mainline churches were during this period. Catholics were still building separate churches for blacks and whites into the early 1960s in some parts of the South. Claims to orthodoxy become very weak when there is almost no orthopraxy. The Third Awakening was not so long ago. It was the steering that led to the labor and civil rights reforms of the mid-20th century. It predisposed American Catholics for the reforms that would come with the Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965. It gave us the beginning of what I call the bias toward the bottom. We can only realize how significantly our thinking has changed back to biblical thinking, where the victims were always the heroes. When we remember that most of human history has idolized kings, money, nobility, fame, and power, the bias toward the top. So let's move on to the security to be insecure. At the time of the Second Vatican Council, we Catholics were very self-confident. All indicators of numbers, vocations, money, and influence were positive and growing. There was no reason to reform or self-criticize. Our identity was clear. Our boundaries were clear, our sense of the absolute was grounded and founded. We knew who we were, and ironically, we were therefore free to criticize ourselves, even from the very top. The ability to self-criticize and our own shadow side is a clear sign of health and interior freedom. A historian of social change once told me that Vatican II was one of the very few times in all of human history that a strong institution reformed itself from the top, when it didn't have to and wasn't forced to. That's a rather strong sign of the presence of God's Spirit. Dom Helder Camara, 1909-1999, the Archbishop of Recife in Brazil, continued to live and preach with joy and confidence even after his human rights programs were discontinued by a later Vatican appointment. Most women, foundresses of religious communities, spent much of their life being opposed by bishops and Roman congregations, yet they humbly moved forward with what they knew God had called them to do. This kind of fire-tried saints will always win the day for God. One of the greatest qualities we must bring to the present malaise, the present dilemma is a sense of history, a sense that we've been here before. We've seen the overlay romantic and the overlay rational before those extremes have been interwoven throughout history. During the best of times, they've balanced each other. We're not in that balance now. We're either cheaply romantic, most media and liberals, or cheaply rational, many conservatives and fundamentalist religions. We're not open, by and large. The great spirituality or the dealing with things holistically and historically. We just react. Many of our social institutions, particularly government, law, education, the church, the military, family, and marriages, have been roundly discredited in the last 70 years, each one its own sad story of lost authority and focus. Unfortunately, this leaves only the media and the business world to communicate daily, meaning for most people. And that is scary. And this is probably the first time in human history that we have tried to carry society on two such tiny and fragile shoulders. It is certain to produce fragile people and a very unstable society. Many feel that the traditional institutions of our culture are impotent and incapable of communicating believable patterns of wisdom and truth, lacking authority and credibility. They do not have the power to lead or guide us. We don't give power to them, and they don't have the consensus or the confidence to take it. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the scandals of the Trump presidency and so much more have made us cynically about government and politics. Recent rationally charged trials have made us cynically about the legal judiciary system, both Catholic and evangelical fundamentalism, plus the sexual scandals of the clergy, have made us cynical about religion. Our universities do not make us into universal people, but instead have become mostly job preparation miles that leave students in debt for most of their careers. At the personal level, our individualism and narcissism have made the skills needed for marriages and family rare. This power and confidence vacuum has opened the door for the far right to seize and exploit the language of religion and God. The tele-evangelist phenomenon within both evangelical Protestantism and pious Catholicism is in great part, I believe, the fault of the liberal establishment in this country, which refuses even to acknowledge transcendence or traditions in any serious way. forcing and overreacting on the other side. Both sides righteously point to the opposite extremes to justify their own positions. True greatness never emerges in such periods. We spend too much time putting out fires, attacking and protecting ourselves, to focus on intelligence and mysticism. What is lost is the healthy middle, where the romantic and the rational can coexist, and that is a big loss. When we take an extreme position, we take part of the responsibility for pushing people to the opposite extreme. When we do not feel safe or secure or at home, we naturally take a strong stance to defend ourselves. Unfortunately, that puts us in a corner that we cannot escape and where others cannot get to us. That's not a very good position from which to proclaim the great good news. Of course, conservatives push the progressives to the same reactionary position by their seeming worship of authority and order as ends in themselves. To educate people, most traditionalists appear to have no interest in honest history or critical thinking, but only in a soft pity and propaganda passing for religion. So, the liberals get out their information, statistics, and scholarship and use them to dismiss the conservatives as promoters of the romantic rubbish. The hunger for meaning and the need for hope in this constructed society cannot be satisfied by merely private sources. This is a real blind spot for most liberals. The issues are too big, and we cannot stand alone against such a dominant cultural collapse. Corporate evil can only be overcome by corporate good. For this reason, and many others, I'm very happy to see the growth of small groups in church and in society. We have to create structures and institutions that think and therefore act differently. We have no past evidence to prove that gospel individuals alone can fully exemplify the reign of God. This is a church-own form of individualism, while it often condemns individualism in the world. Until we question our very lifestyle, nothing truly is going to happen. And I'm going to stop here so that it's reasonable to swallow it all in and to think about it. I know this is hard stuff, but this is the reality. And I think we cannot stay blind in the reality that we see, or maybe don't want to see. And I do believe that it is the time that we will open and ask God to remove the blindness from our eyes so that we see very clear. It is our responsibilities as Christians, in whatever denomination we are. I'm not going to fight over that. That's not my place to do that. The most important thing is that we find each other and that we grow together, and that the world sees that we still will and always will make the difference. So go through this, and there is another part too of the Great Awakenings. May God bless you. This is your Pastor Yadi. Bye-bye.